Gems. This is my regular video series in which I go over older board game gems. But in this episode, I'm ranting. This is a BG Gibber episode. I just talk about what comes to me. It's a talking head video. I know that's not super appealing. If you want, you can just... This is not super appealing. Switch to audio only if you want, put it on like a podcast and listen to it while you do some chores or something. I'm just going to talk about some topics that have been in the forefront of my mind, and these are board game related topics, of course. I'm a grumpy old man in this hobby, and I know some of these are going to be what my son calls old head takes. This is my video channel, darn it. So... let's just get started. Let's get this over with. I want to talk briefly about a Dutch board game company called Splotter. And I'm bringing this up. They're pretty well known in the hobby, but I've never played a Splotter game, ever. I own Bus. It's the newest capstone, I believe, reprint of Bus, which is one of theirs. And I came to the point where I almost played a game of Roads and Boats, but... And I fell asleep at a table that was playing Antiquity, and I did not drool very much into the Antiquity box, if I recall. In every artistic field, you're going to have people who, they're marching to their own beat. They're doing their own thing. They're making things that they like, and they don't care so much about making money necessarily. They hope to make money, but it's not their focus. Like, their focus is on just doing what they want. And getting a huge amount of cred for it. There's lots of bands that were kind of punk or indie, early in their career, and then later on they sold out. And there's some bands that never sold out, man. And that feels like Splotter to me in the board game space. They make cool games. Most of them are far too long for what I'm usually looking for in games. But I'm getting my first Splotter games coming soon. I pre-ordered them directly from Splotter. So I'm getting The Great Zimbabwe, and that is the one that seems to have the most appeal to people who like the same types of games that I do. They seem to have the most to say positively about The Great Zimbabwe, so looking forward to that. And also doesn't seem like one of their longer games. The other one being Food Chain Magnate, and... that really does not seem like my type of game, but of course I own a restaurant. I guess I technically own a chain of restaurants because I own 2. That is the minimum number you need for a chain. So that's kind of about the same topic, right? So I'm kind of interested, even though the game really doesn't look like my type of game, but I am still interested because of the subject matter. I am excited to get my first Splotter games, and we'll see how that goes. And certainly when I'm able to get them played, I will, of course, be happy to share them, my views on them on the channel. After I pre-ordered those, they announced their newest game, which is called Horseless Carriage. This is interesting because Splotter, in some ways, are known for making really long, very unforgiving, in that if you make mistakes early, maybe you're out of the running and you can't win, right? It rewards good play, punishes bad play, and are very, very interactive. Now, it sounds like Horseless Carriage doesn't really have much of a central board, and instead each player has their own personal tableau. So, okay, this is kind of more in the modern Euro kind of framework, right? But it's for 3 to 5 players. Now, the fact that they do not have you able to play 2 players out of the box, and there's no solo mode, should tell you something about this game. And there are people on Board Game Geek who are like, geez, how hard would it have been for them to add a solo mode? I love solo play. Sometimes it's the only way I can play games is solo mode, right? They should be doing this. And then others are like, you don't want a solo mode for a game that wouldn't be good solo. You have to trust the designers on this. If you're playing a multiplayer solitaire game, then yeah, you can easily make a solo mode for it. If there's no solo mode, if there isn't even a 2-player mode, that says something about the type of game it is. Just based on that one little fact alone, it sounds very, very interactive. So I am also very much looking forward to Horseless Carriage. I think I'll wait for it to come out and read some reviews. Splotter does not seem like the type of company that I want to just jump in on, even though I could probably resell the games easily if I don't like them. But yeah, I'll take a wait and see on that. But I just wanted to point that out for anybody who seems disappointed when a game comes out 3 to 5 players and doesn't have a solo mode, it doesn't have a 2-player mode. Let it go. It just might mean that game is very, very good 3-player or 4-player or 5-player, such that it wouldn't even feel like the same game if you played with fewer, and so why even bother? There's lots of games in the world. Why not play this game and see it at its best? I've been kind of keeping my eye out for the one game, the one modern Euro that comes out and makes people who are fans of modern Euros rethink some of their life choices. You know, with board games, with anything, right? You have trends. And one way of trying to stay ahead of the trends and try to stay current is to see the direction things are going and then try to jump ahead of that, right? So if people like this, but they seem to like this more, let's give them this, right? And so modern Euros over time have become more multiplayer solitaire in the sense that everybody's more worried about their own focus, their own tableau, their own hand of cards. They can't really care about what other people are doing. The role of a central area or central board is minimized, and if there is interaction over there, it's just incidental. Maybe throw in special powers and crazy combos, right? People love that stuff. Every modern Euro that comes out, I wonder, is like, will this be the one that goes a bridge too far? And I had that first feeling with a game called Tapestry. Now, the company who makes that, Stonemaier Games, very, very popular, kind of grassroots popular hobby publisher, and they have a lot of games that are crazy, crazy popular. Games like Wingspan and Scythe and Viticulture and so on. And Tapestry, to me, was very much a parody in some ways of modern Euros for two main reasons. Because actually, Tapestry does have a central board that you play on and you can lightly interact with each other. The tableau. Each player has their own little tableau, which is a little grid, onto which they place buildings. And the buildings may give you some benefit, or they give you points if you're able to fill rows and columns. It's an unnecessary puzzle. And the pieces you put on those board are these ridiculous town minis, like these buildings. The over-the-top, unnecessary components. That's a parody. To have these gorgeous components for a completely unnecessary purpose. And so, like, Tapestry could have been an okay game without that little city board completely, right? Everybody just playing on the central board. But no, everybody has to have their own little tableau. That's important. Do their own little puzzle on their own little tableau. You gotta have that. The other thing that I thought Tapestry was kind of a parody of was in relation to the scoring. So you have scores that are in the hundreds, 200s, 300s. Somebody does well in Tapestry, they could have a score in the 300s or 400s, right? The scores just shoot way up. But there's little mechanisms for scoring 1 point here and there. So like when you add a little hexagonal tile to the board, you're expanding kind of the land on Tapestry, right? If I remember correctly, you get 1 point for every side of the hexagonal tile that you're able to match with another tile. So the game has a very slight encouragement, right, to have you match things, but you don't have to. You're not required to. You just have this extremely tiny little incentive to do that. And it's one of those unnecessary decisions. If your score is in the hundreds, do you really need to score 1 point here or there just matching up sides on a hexagon? And to me, Tapestry really comes in as a game that sees like this game is popular, then next year this game is popular, and you can see it's going a little bit more in this direction, and the year after this is popular, so let's give them this, right? Let's oh, they want this, let's give them all of it, right? And so in my head I was wondering, I played Tapestry, it felt like a parody of a modern Euro to me. Like I was almost laughing when I see this sort of game. I wonder, especially if it's like got huge hype or huge buzz, which any Stonemaier game does, is will this be the tipping point? This is going so far in that direction. Is this the game that will divide, will cleave the hobby people, the board game geeks, the hobbyists, in two, where some people love it and some people absolutely hate it? Because that's the time where it goes too far, and some people may drop out and go, oh my god, this is... I mean, they were just giving us what we asked for, but do we really want this? Is this good? I can't tell. And Tapestry was divisive. It was. But in the end, it didn't change anything. So, what other games fit that mold? On the OG Guild, which is a great guild, you should join it. You should join the OG Guild on Board Game Geek. There was one person who said that they thought Lost Ruins of Arnak. I haven't played Lost Ruins of Arnak. I can't offer an opinion. Another game I haven't played, but I do have an opinion on, is a game called... Okay, so it's a Japanese name. Now, I don't speak Japanese. I think, like, the U vowel is often kind of shortened, abbreviated. So I want to pronounce it something like Bitoku. This might be it. This might be it. Okay. This looks like a parody of a game to me. Okay. So have a look at this photo. Hopefully I'll be able to include this photo here. Massive board. Lovely artwork. Million things going around, happening on the board. The art looks lovely, but there is so much happening. The art is mixing kind of seamlessly with the small and not very standing out iconography. There's about looks like 15 different places of the board you need to be paying attention to, and the board looks quite large. It has this made up fantasy setting about forest spirits or some such nonsense. Besides this crazy board, it also has individual player boards, because of course it does. There were some people who said, like, this looks amazing, I have to play this. And there are other people who go, this just looks like a headache if I try to play this game, right? I'm definitely of the latter camp. And I wonder, is this it? Is this the game that tips things over? Is this the game that turns off half of hobbyists and go, oh my god, this is the end result. We have asked for this, and now this is the end result of all our desires and wants, and I can't even imagine playing this game. I'd be curious to know how it is. Doesn't mean I'll want to go and find out how it is. I am not playing this game. I refuse. You cannot pay me money to play this game. Is that the one that kind of is that bridge too far, that makes people go, what are we even doing in this hobby? So what is one of the most popular modern Euros? I mean, there are lots. One of them is Wingspan. I was very happy years ago when I saw a big, long New York Times article about Wingspan. It's like, it is great that Wingspan has gotten so much attention. And I'm very happy for Stonemaier that they made this game that is very popular and has sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Here's where I admit that I don't like Wingspan. I don't hate it. It's just not my type of game. Again, it's that same sort of thing that I always talk about. It's a tableau builder, right? Where you don't really care what other people are doing. Maybe they make some food that you could use, but when your turn comes around, you'll just have a look. You're not basing your whole strategy on what other people are doing. There's a large deck of unique cards, and so the main part of the game is just having your hand of cards and figuring out, the order where you want to play them and stuff. Nice little puzzle, but not an interactive game at all. It's just play it by yourself. Don't even invite friends over. Just play it by yourself. At least it's a real world theme. I love to rag on fairy tale fantasy settings, and at least this is real world. And that's a topic that I want to bring up because I find it interesting when people make an assumption about why you don't like something. And this happens with Wingspan. And it also happens with phones, okay? I find this fascinating. So I have an Android phone, like a lot of people do. And I have like staff who work in my restaurant, and they notice, or maybe it comes up in conversation or something, they notice I have an Android. I mean, a lot of them have Androids too, but a lot of them have iPhones. And some of them, this has happened multiple times to my surprise, some of them have made the mental jump that I use an Android phone, therefore I hate Apple products. I would say, like, oh yeah, I have an Android phone. It's like, oh, you hate Apple products, do you? Like, what? They didn't say it like derisively. They were just like, matter of fact, oh, okay, so you don't like Apple products. Punk! I have a Mac Mini at home. That's my main workhorse. I have an iPad. I like Apple. I like Apple products. But I don't need to pay through the nose for an iPhone when I'm using my phone for making calls, text messages. I mean, that's the main thing, honestly. Listening to podcasts or something. You don't need an expensive phone to do a lot of the stuff that I use it for. But people just make that assumption, and it's so funny to me. And people have made that assumption with me about Wingspan. I know it's happened with some customers, so I've always tried to make a point, like at the restaurant, I always try to be like super positive about games, right? But sometimes people ask me, you know, what do you think of Wingspan? And I don't lie to people, right? I tell them, oh, I'm not much of a fan. And they will say like, oh yeah, it's the theme, isn't it? Yeah, birds, kind of boring. I get it. Punk! I don't say this to my customers. But punk! I love the theme. I love the setting. I love the real world birds, the non-fantasy setting. And I think I would hate the game much more if it had that typical fairy tale fantasy setting. But people assume that the only reason, or the most obvious reason, that I could dislike Wingspan is because I just don't like the theme and setting. I think birds are boring. And I think the theme and setting is the most wonderful part of Wingspan. I just don't like that type of game. This topic is triggered because I just got my most recent issue of Spielbox, and this is the cover of Spielbox. So you can have a look here. This is Quest of the Moonstones, and you have a cat that's being ridden by these infantilized, big-eyed kind of, boy and girl wizards or something. And this is everything I hate about modern board game themes and settings. This is the fairy tale fantasy art, right? As opposed to the typical swords and sorcery stuff. Like, I get from a hobby point of view, a lot of people find that boring. The swords and sorcery, the typical, Dungeons and Dragons, Lord of the Rings kind of tropes, right? A lot of people are like, oh, those are boring. It's always the same thing, Like, we should have more interesting fantasy settings. And then you get stuff like this. Like, I understand why swords and sorcery might be boring. I'm not a big fan of swords and sorcery myself. I can understand why people would find it derivative. I just don't like fantasy in general. But to me, this is worse because it's so childish. I am in my mid-40s, and I would not want to play a game like this with this art style. And already, some of you are screaming at the camera. Don't do that. People think you're crazy. They will yell at me and say, Daryl, that's not a fair comparison. Look, it says Kids Chronicles. It's obviously a kid's game. And if you have said that or thought that, you have fallen into my trap. Because my exact point is, to me, this is no different than the vast majority of fairy tale fantasy themes and settings in board games right now. There are people in the world who would be very interested in board games, who would not be caught dead playing a game that looked like that. Like in the previous BG Gibber episode, I talked about Carolus Magnus's rethemed to a fairy tale fantasy setting to be called the very generic sounding Ariantis. I remembered the name. To me, it feels like taking, Citizen Kane and remaking Citizen Kane in IMAX 3D, but all the characters are anthropomorphic animals. Or kids. Why not kids? That works too. You know, it's a pretty good game. Manhattan. One Spiel des Jahres back in 94, I think. Great game. I have the original, or one of the Hans and Gluck or Rio Grande editions anyway. I don't have it here to show you, but let's bring up a picture. And, you know, it's pretty generic looking, right? It's just buildings. You know, it's kind of dynamic, right? But you need people. You need faces on the cover. That's what everybody says now. You need a face. You can't just have an app on a phone with a symbol that means the thing, you know, especially if it's a game. You know what you need? You need a face. You need an angry face, maybe with a big mouth and big eyes, being really expressive, and that's appealing, right? So anyway, a few years ago, they had a new version of Manhattan. I will probably get to Manhattan for this video series at some point. Anyway, this is the cover of the most recent edition of Manhattan, but specifically I want to talk about the people on the cover. Now, these are seemingly, for the most part, definitely intended to be adults. I can tell this is a kid, but this is like an old woman, for example, right? So there's a variety of people, but most of them are adults. But this guy stands out the most on the cover. I don't know about you, but I cannot look at him as an adult. He's wearing a suit. I do think he is intended to be an adult, or perhaps a particularly youthful-looking adult. But I look at this and I just think it's a teenager who's dressed up for the day. This is kind of changing Manhattan and making it... I guess they think it's making it look more fun, but to me it just looks more silly. And it makes it look more like they're trying to make it look like a kid's game. People are going to think I'm some, you know, grumpy old person who complains about the kids these days and their, you know, and he's lost touch with his childhood, and that, hey, I'm an adult fan of Lego. I like some kids' things, okay? I have not lost touch with my childhood. But I do think that if a game is appealing to a wide variety of people, then the theme and setting should respect that and be appealing to a wide range of people. And when you take a game and you give it, for example, a childish theme and setting, you are telling a portion of your potential gaming audience that this game is for kids. And for young at heart adults, sure. But they don't realize that turns some people away because they're not interested in that, right? You have the old themes and settings, which some might say boring, you know, and I mean, certainly like trading in the Mediterranean is not going to be popular with kids, right? But like, if you have like a kind of a game that probably wouldn't be all that interesting to kids, if it's a game that you picture mostly adults will play with each other, there's nothing wrong with giving it a more mature adult theme and setting. And I don't mean that in a sexy way, okay? I mean like for adults. There's nothing wrong with liking things that are aimed at kids, right? You know, young adult novels are popular with all sorts of age groups. That's kind of the world we live in nowadays. I guess I just want to say that a lot of hobbyists don't realize that infantilizing their game themes and their game artwork will turn off some people. I want games to appeal to as wide a variety of people as possible. I know there would be people who hear my complaints about fairy tale fantasy and the infantilization of game covers and stuff and think that's a form of gatekeeping. Every attempt at fighting against gatekeeping will eventually be accused of being gatekeeping itself. Every year, there's more and more board games that come out. And every year, people are like, there's too many games, we can't possibly play them all. You have to kind of focus, but at some point, you know, there's going to be too many games on the marketplace, and there's not going to be enough support for these games. You know, a lot of these companies are going to fail. There's going to be some sort of market crash or something. People have been predicting this forever, and it hasn't happened yet. But certainly, the more and more games that come out, the harder and harder it is for a game to become popular. How does a game become popular? I mean, there are a few factors, right? You have trendsetters. Now, this doesn't have to be YouTubers, although I have heard that this is a big thing. There are a couple of very famous board game YouTubers, and if you can, ride the coattails of their popularity, then that's going to be good for you. Get more eyeballs onto your game. But it's not just people who have like a platform. There have always been these trendsetters, these hardcore hobbyists who are on the kind of the front lines, the cutting edge of what new games are coming out. And then they get these games, they're cult of the new, they acquire these new games, they want to try them, they introduce them to their game group, and their game group maybe aren't quite as hardcore as they are. They love board games, but they're not keeping on top of the new news and all the hot new releases, right? This one person, this alpha gamer, they're doing it. And so they decide what game they think they'd be interested in or they think would be good. They get that. They introduce it to their group. Maybe some of them love it. And then they get it for their own families, for example. So that's definitely a way that a board game can become popular. But it is harder and harder to get eyeballs on your game. And it becomes harder again, even if your game is well regarded. It's an older game. Very good reviews. People think it's an amazing classic game. New version comes out. Your company, you put out a new version of this old classic game. How do you get eyeballs on that? To grab the attention of the alpha gamers, and these are presumably like trendsetters, right? And a lot of these trendsetters weren't necessarily in the hobby when those games came out and became popular and became classics. They're coming in later, right? So how does a hobby gamer, like a hardcore hobby board gamer, how do they decide what games of their limited choices that they have available to them to focus on? Because they can't buy everything. So you have to get attention, right? So you have to make your game look amazing. And we would think that used to be just amazing art. Like that should do it. But you have a game like Medici. Like this is the version of Medici that came out in 2006. It's fine. It's Medici, right? But maybe not very exciting. People think that art is not very exciting. So a new version of Medici just a couple of years ago is this. Now, isn't this amazing artwork for Medici? Didn't seem to help. Didn't seem to help. This did not sell all that great, I am told. Well, that's disappointing because Medici is a fantastic game. So it's not just art that makes a game stand out. We used to think like, oh, you just take those old games with the boring covers, give them a fresh new coat of paint, new artwork, and introduce them to a whole new group of people, new hobbyists who maybe haven't had the joy of experiencing these games before. It's not enough. What stands out? Well, certainly if you look at Kickstarter, it's those games with tons of minis. There is overlap between board games and miniature war games, like the Warhammers of the world. There are people who just love minis. And there's a section of mini war game players. I'm not talking about like Hex and Counter war games, I'm talking about miniature games like Warhammer. There are people who play those types of games and also play board games. And they would look at a minis heavy game and they'd go, you know what? Those minis look amazing. Even if the board game is terrible, at least I'll have some awesome minis that I can use in my fantasy minis game or perhaps my role-playing game, right? Use minis, maybe use those minis as monsters in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign or something. So, I mean, that's a part of it too. And you're not going to be able to reprint a game like Medici with tons of minis. It's just not that type of game. Even if you have lovely artwork like this, it's just not going to stand out in a crowded marketplace, which is very, very sad. So there's going to be so many people who just pass this game by. They don't know anything like Medici. What even is that? They don't know this is like a classic. But I think it's a great idea that somebody had in the guild is an essentials line. A series of games with these old classic OGs, these old classic games that are not very expensive. Maybe they have relatively simple presentations, I don't know. But anyway, keep the price down. Market them heavily toward those people who are entering the hobby and exploring it. You think of Catan and Ticket to Ride. We used to think of those as sort of hobby games, but kind of gateway. So people learn those, play those, and then maybe, potentially, move on to something else. But now the Catans and the Ticket to Rides and that's mass market. Right? Those aren't gateway games anymore. I'd argue these could be the new gateway games that introduce people to more thoughtfulness, more complexity. Not much more complexity necessarily, but some more complexity. But they would have to be kind of still approachable. So Medici, some other Knizia games would be like Raw, Through the Desert, Samurai. These are all really approachable games. I can think of a lot of other examples. Maybe even stuff like El Grande and that. But I probably wouldn't go too much heavier than that. Maybe Tikal, stuff like that. Mississippi Queen. Super Meeple does a great job with their remakes. But Asmodee tried it, sort of. Asmodee, Fantasy Flight, which is part of Asmodee, had their Euro Classics line. And that had games like Tigris and Euphrates and Taj Mahal, all Knizias. It wasn't going to be all Knizias forever, but the ones they came out with were Knizias. So Tigris and Euphrates, Taj Mahal, Through the Desert, Samurai, Raw. And I think the next one they were going to do was Princess of Florence. Great idea. The thing is, they kind of priced them too high. They kind of priced them like deluxe editions of games, and then they marketed them to hobbyists. The problem is they weren't really deluxe editions. They had refreshed artwork, but sometimes the components weren't really any better than the old editions. Right? Like Tigris and Euphrates, for example, the old edition had wooden cubes, now they're little cardboard pieces. Works fine. Cubes are a little nicer. Anyway, the new version's not deluxe, is my point, but it was priced like a deluxe game. And apparently did not sell very well. You could have a publisher do something like this production, right? So this is it's kind of a bare bones production. It's perfectly serviceable. It's just a board and tiles and little wooden shaped colored pieces, right? It's completely fine, completely serviceable, not very expensive, small box. It would be amazing to see that from maybe a smaller publisher, because a big publisher like Asmodee or Hasbro or Mattel, they will need huge sales to justify it. They're not going to be satisfied just doing, little print runs here and there. It's very hard, and I don't know easily who could do it. I know Super Meeple has a really great track record with some of their reprints. There's no formal essentials or must-haves line, right? But they have great versions of Mississippi Queen and Amun-Re and Tikal and Mexica, and that's great. And I wish them the best of luck. Their productions are great, and they generally don't really change much of anything in terms of the rules, which is the way it should be. They became classics for a reason. I would love to see that sort of thing, some sort of essentials line. There is the Dice Tower Essentials, which aren't really essentials. Sheriff of Nottingham was fine. I don't think any of the other ones are essential, though. But anyway, wow, just kind of all over the place today, with these rants. So I apologize. You know what? I'm probably not going to put too much effort into editing this. I'll just put it up. I just wanted to chat, and you didn't have to listen, but I appreciate that you did. Well, thanks for listening. Older games do not stop being good just because newer games come out. Take care.